So at this point, I'm going to switch the story to the story of the life of Catherine de' Medici, and it's an incredible life. I said at the beginning that I can only really do this episode will only be sort of sweeping narratives. And so we'll leave the story of Pope Clement VII and switch over to Catherine de' Medici. So she eventually, when she became old enough, was married off to one of the princes of France, Henry. He was the second son, so wasn't necessarily going to become King of France. But his older brother died and he did become King of France, became Henry II of France. And so this Catherine de' Medici is Queen of France. So now, again, if you look at the trajectory of the Medici family here, they've gone from nobodies to rich bankers to preeminently and supremely rich bankers to being ennobled, being dukes of places like Ferrara and Urbino, and now, and popes, and now one of their own is fully royal because her children became the kings of France, the Valois, the last Valois. Now, Catherine de' Medici lives to be quite old, in her late 60s or early 70s, is it? And her whole life really is one of those lives that's sort of filled with events and adventure. Now, her marriage to Henry wasn't a particularly nice or loving one. It didn't seem that he particularly liked her. It was a political marriage first and foremost, and they didn't really love each other. Certainly Henry didn't love her. He had a mistress who was 10 years older than him, Diane, and he loved her. He wanted to spend all his time with her and lavish his attention on her, not Catherine de' Medici. And so Catherine, for the first 10 years, roughly, of their marriage, she was childless. Now, if you're going to be a queen or a queen consort, you know, the nature of hereditary rule is that you have to provide heirs, male heirs, and spares if possible. So for the first 10 years of her marriage, not producing any children was a real problem. And people thought maybe she was barren, or maybe the king was firing blanks, who knows? Anyway, eventually, well, he wasn't, because he had illegitimate children by other people. But eventually, she ended up having, 8 or 9 or 10 children, and only 1 or 2 of them died sort of straight away in infancy. And so in the end, she proved to be very fertile. Finally, she had twins, twin girls, that both died in infancy, and there was some sort of complication in the birth. And so she couldn't really have children beyond that. Yet, you know, she had done her job of providing heirs, particularly male heirs. What was there, 4 or even 5? Certainly 4 boys. And so, yeah, she had fulfilled her main role as Queen of France. But then an unfortunate thing happened. Henry II, King of France, had a jousting accident. He was apparently quite a good jouster and enjoyed the tournament. And at one particular tournament, he'd knocked a couple of guys off their horses, and one of his opponents knocked him off his horse, knocked the wind out of him. And of course, it's very embarrassing. Most contestants in the joust, if you were put up against the king, or even sort of an heir apparent, or even an extremely powerful and rich duke, something like that, you'd probably let them win, or you wouldn't really go as hard as you possibly could against them. But this guy did, knocked Henry II off his horse. So Henry gets back on his horse, and a bit later, once he's sort of got his wind back, insists on riding against this guy again, the same guy, Gabriel Montgomery. So when they rode out against each other again, Montgomery does the same thing, just tries as hard as he can, like it's any other legit contest. And his lance smashes into the king's face, and splinters go into his eye and into his brain. He basically kills the king, because Henry II lived for a while, about another week or 10 days or so, and regained consciousness and was able to sit up and speak a bit, but eventually lapsed into a coma and died. And Catherine de' Medici, from that point onwards, had her sort of personal coat of arms, had this sort of this splintered lance on it. And she really played up, forevermore, for decades after this, played up the idea that she was this widowed queen, and a bit like Queen Victoria, always wore black, nearly always wore black for the rest of her life. She was in mourning for the rest of her life. The foundation of her whole political position was that she was the widowed wife of Henry II. Apparently the scene actually at the time was really gory, like he sort of busted his head open. It seems really, really gory and horrible. That blood was just streaming all down his face and all down him, and that Diane, his mistress, and Catherine de' Medici, his wife, and his eldest son, they all fainted. They literally fainted from seeing this accident. And so the crown of France passes to Catherine de' Medici's children, her eldest boy. It goes to her eldest boy, who is a Francis. He becomes Francis II of France, and he's a teenager. And so Catherine de' Medici, as the king mother, sort of fairly suddenly becomes extremely powerful. Whilst the old king, her husband Henry, had been king, he'd kept her completely locked out, really, more or less, of power, real power, the business of government, anything like that. He didn't really like her, it seems. He didn't want her anywhere near any sort of decision making. But now she was, because she was sort of a type of regent now. Her son wasn't really old enough, or didn't really have a force of character or personality enough to just start ruling completely in his own right. So his mother starts doing so. She immediately gets rid of Diane, her husband's favourite concubine, gets rid of her and her faction at court. Doesn't murder her or anything, but she's just sort of sidelined and got rid of. And so Catherine de' Medici becomes genuinely powerful. But a long story short, that Francis II doesn't live all that long, and he dies of natural causes. A lot of Catherine de' Medici's children were sickly. They weren't particularly robust. They suffered from ill health. And so Francis II dies. And so it goes to the next boy, Catherine de' Medici's next son, who is a Charles. He's Charles IX of France, and he's only like 9 years old. During his coronation, apparently he just cried. You know, it's just a kid. It's far too big for him to deal with, to be king of France. Especially in a tumultuous time, when there's all sorts of civil wars and religious wars going on. And there's no way a 9-year-old boy can hope of wielding any power, really. And so Catherine de' Medici's influence and power grows even more. She is really the power in France. And where she always wears black in mourning forevermore, she's known as, in one way, the Black Queen of France. Because you can imagine a lot of French people, the French rank and file, French peasantry, or even middle classes, a lot of the nobility, a lot of French people looked at her and saw her as an Italian upstart. You know, who are the Medici family, really? They were bankers not that long ago. And now this Italian money-lender type woman is the Queen of France and calling all the shots. And Catherine was quite good as a politician or a statesperson or a diplomat, but not brilliant. She was quite good. I mean, it wasn't a complete car crash. She didn't sort of endlessly make the wrong call. Some people in history do that, right? You look at their record, you look at the decisions they made, and it's just sort of endlessly bad. It's not that, but she did make some bad decisions, allowed France to descend into chaos and anarchy and civil wars here or there. But she was given a very, very difficult hand. You know, the end of the 16th century in France was a very difficult time. I think really anyone would have struggled to keep it all together. You know, you would have needed to have been a Napoleon or a Charlemagne type, extremely, extremely strong, extremely successful militarily, in order to avoid just a complete mess. And so Catherine sort of ruled over and lived through really a very, very messy time. So the 9-year-old king, Charles IX, he rules for a few years, and then he dies of natural causes. And so it then passes to Catherine's next son, who is a Henry. He becomes Henry III, King of France. Now he's a bit older though, and Catherine's getting on a bit by this point. Henry III is more like 22, 23 years old by the time he becomes king. And so, you know, he's a grown man, so he doesn't necessarily need or really want his mother to be calling all the shots anymore. So there's some sort of low-level, low-key power struggle between them, and eventually, long story short, Henry III becomes king fully in his own right, that he's sort of calling all the shots, that the cockpit of power is with him. And I mentioned the Huguenots. I think a lot of people, when they hear Huguenots, especially if you're a Brit, you think of sort of Dutch or Belgian Huguenots coming over to England, but there were far more French Huguenots than anything else. And there was basically civil wars. A really, really important family in all of this in France was the Guise family. And there's all sorts of highs and lows with internal strife between the Catholics and the Huguenots and the royal family, and it's very, very messy and confusing. In the end, this Henry III gets some of the Guise family, lures them and murders them, and that was a mistake. And eventually, Catherine dies of old age, knowing that the third of her sons to become king has probably overplayed his hand, and that her whole dynasty is probably not long for this world. And she was right. I mean, it really just did get very, very bloody. There's a famous event, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Lots of people personally blamed Catherine Medici for that. And when historians look back on it, sort of with 2020 hindsight and with a clearer vision, not being blinded by sort of religious hatred or biased one way or another, it seems almost certain that she wasn't necessarily responsible for it, because she'd worked against that sort of thing before and after. But nevertheless, she was blamed in her own lifetime for a big massacre of Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day. And eventually her popularity in France just plummeted, and she did die kind of hated.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.